Hi, everyone. Welcome to User's Guide for the Soul. We're recording on the cloud, and now we're going to live to Facebook. So welcome to User's Guide for the Soul. Anyone who's on Facebook, we're live on Facebook now, so please join us. And I'm going to open up my phone so you can add your comments, and I can bring those right into class. I'm going to pull you guys up, so feel free to be a part of the class today. And also in the future, if you want to be right here in the Zoom, email Maya at temple-israel.org, and she can connect you to the class. Hope everybody is doing well. Hope we may finish chapter 37, which is the end of a very powerful section of the Tanya. So we're hoping to get through to the end of that today. And it is this whole section is really giving us the big why of life. We spent the 34 chapters before learning how to ideally integrate our soul with our body, how to meditate in Judaism through two pathways, the long-short and the short-long pathway, and how to make sure that we're always in a state of joy so that we can actually put into place all the tools that we learned.
I have a question.
Yes, Noreen.
Am I transferring the Chabad, or is it just for that moment? Is it permanent, or is it just for that moment?
Okay. Well, let me answer that when I just catch everybody up, because you're asking a question about specifically something we raised last week.
Okay.
Yeah. So now that we've learned how to be a highest functioning Jewish person, as we have a manual for life, as it were, that's complete. Now we're answering the question, but why do it? If, as we learned, if I can't completely transform my emotions to be like a tzaddik, and as Noreen just asked, I can transform my intellect, but not my emotions, then isn't this a lower grade Judaism? Are you giving me Judaism 101? Why should I do that? And the Alter Rebbe is trying to show us that, in fact, action is the whole point of reality and creation, even for a tzaddik. As we learned last week, why did a tzaddik come down to the world? Not to transform their emotions and experience love and awe for God, but rather to do a physical mitzvah, just like you and I did. And by doing that, they create a home for God here in the world, and they elevate their share of the world, and that's why they were created. So why does a tzaddik come to be a Jewish soul and a Jewish body? To do a physical mitzvah. And why do we come? To do a physical mitzvah. And what people miss about the mitzvah that Kabbalah explains is that it's so surrendered to God that we become like a chariot. We bring the Shekhinah right here into our life, and we elevate that piece of the world and everything that's attached to it. We learned last week that, in fact, you can, as a Beinoni, as a person who's a normal, struggling person who's just doing the right thing by mind over matter, as it were, by the mind over the heart, that as a Beinoni, we can actually transform our Chabad, our intellect, so that although our emotions are still that of an immature, normal person, our intellect can be transformed so it's like a second divine soul. Our animal soul intellect can be changed and transformed by enough Torah study and enough meditation that we can have the intellect of like we have two divine souls. Right? So, Noreen, your question was, is that just for the moment, or is that a permanent thing? We were talking about permanent. We were talking about something that takes years and years of meditation and learning and reframing your mind and reprogramming with the neuroplasticity we now know about, so that all my pathways change, and every situation I hit, my perspective is not what's in it for me. My perspective is what's in it for the other person, or for the infinite. How can I serve the world? How can I serve God? And it is possible for someone like me or most of us to transform our intellect, our Chabad, so that we're like a tzaddik, and that is actually a permanent change if you do it. And now here we are. We get to the end of this chapter, where the Alter Rebbe revisits Torah study, because now that we talked so much about the core value, and that the whole purpose of reality is to do these physical mitzvahs, of course, we want to make sure we don't go too far and not recognize the quality of Torah study, which is perhaps not greater, but higher. Perhaps not greater, but higher, which we'll get to. And so tradition says that that Torah study is compared to all the other mitzvahs combined in the same way as charity, we just learned, was compared to all the other mitzvahs combined. Even though mathematically that does not make sense, kabbalistically we're explaining, and the simple answer is each one of them has an advantage. The advantage of mitzvahs, as we've been learning for 3 chapters, is you take a spark of reality and elevate it and make a home for God in the physical world. And for that, my knowledge, my insight, my emotions they're not the bottom line. Doing the physical mitzvah, that's the bottom line. But Torah study, the advantage is, one that we learned is that it can actually transform my intellect. And a second now that we just started is the amount of connection and manifestation of the divine light that I have through Torah study. So we're now gonna go into that to make sure we don't go too far in the direction of just physical mitzvahs without the mind and the heart and the oomph. So let's begin. We're at the bottom of 519. וכמו באדם התחתון דרך משל אין ערך ודמיון כלל בין החיות שברמ"ח איבריו לגבי החיות שבמוחין, שהוא השכל המתחלק לג' בחינות חוכמה בינה דעת.
Just as, for example, in the case of a human being, the vitality in his 248 organs bears no comparison or similarity to the vitality in his brain, that is the intellect, which is divided into the 3 faculties of Chokhmah, Bina, and Dat.
So look at, as we said, look at my own body. Look at my own body. Hi, Melinda. Nice to have you on Facebook. Please leave any questions you have in the comments. Yeah, so I'm going to be watching those. The amount of my being, my energy, my intellect, who I am, that's manifest in my brain, which is all my thoughts, which is even driving my emotions, which is controlling my whole body, which is making my heart beat, making my lungs breathe, that is so much more manifest, the energy of my soul, than my pinky, the knuckle of my pinky, right? Both are alive. Both are equally alive, as we said. But if you say, how much of my soul is manifest in this piece of my pinky, and how much is manifest in my frontal, what is it called? The frontal cortex? Someone help me out? Yeah, that's a thing, right? I forgot the term, but the executive function thing here, right? I forgot the term for a moment. Obviously, I'm more manifest in my brain. That's where I'm aware of my soul entering my body, where my intellect becomes physical thought. It's more manifest there than in my pinky. And yet, they're both equally me. They're both equally alive. It's the same thing. That's an example. Oh, we got some more in the waiting room. Come on in. Hi, guys. Welcome. That example is the way that we can try and understand the difference between the way the light of God manifests in a physical mitzvah versus the way the light of God manifests in my soul when I'm learning Torah. Right? When you do a mitzvah, yes, you're creating a home for God, you're elevating the world, but when I look at a sukkah, how much of God's light is actually manifest? Yes, it's surrender to God, I'm elevating the world, I get it, but how much of God's light is actually manifest in that wood, right? In that schach? I still look and I see just physical. But when I'm learning Torah, there, God's intellect, which we've learned is not, you can't separate God's intellect from God. It's not like you and me. God's intellect is unified with God. And that's God's intellect that came down like water. And I'm picking it up down here. And it's the same water as it was up in the clouds. And it's the same intellect as it was in the heavens. Because God's intellect can never separate from God. So though it looks like when I'm learning Torah, I'm just discussing scenarios of what's pure and impure, or when I do this or when I do that, and physical stuff. It's actually God's very intellect that's now manifest in my soul. And the same way you can't compare the manifestation of me in my brain to my pinky, you can't compare the manifestation of God's essence and God's light that's there and manifest in Torah study to a physical mitzvah. That's the big advantage. So we'll go inside. Any questions about that? Welcome to a few new people. Any questions about the topic we're looking at? Good. Let's go. Topic 520. Kach mamash derech mashal. Lavdil berivot havdalot le'en ketz.
Just as it is in the case of a human being, so too, by way of analogy, allowing for the qualification that any comparison between human and divine traits must be distant, however, by myriads of degrees.
All right, so as we know, whenever we have an example and we're using a human to try and describe God, there's no similarity whatsoever. There's infinite degrees of difference, but just so we can start to understand, we're making an analogy. Beharat or insof baruch hu hamitlab shot b'mitzvot masiyot legabe he'arat or insof shebchinat chochma bin adat shebechochmat haTorah ish kefi sichlo v'hasagato. Yeah, Maxine, you want to unmute, please.
Yeah.
There you go.
Okay, is it with regard to the illumination of the Ein Sof light clothed in mitzvot of action compared to the illumination of the Ein Sof light clothed in the Chabad faculties of one immersed in the wisdom of Torah, an illumination commensurate with the level of each man's intellect and his grasp at Torah, to the extent that his intellect grasps the Torah, which he studies, it is united with godliness, with a unity comparable to that of one's intellect with his soul.
So right now, although we feel like we're just thinking about another subject, we might be learning geography, we might be learning mathematics, and we happen to be learning Tanya, and they're basically all in the same category to us. That's because we're so different from the Ein Sof. We can't recognize that the Ein Sof's intellect is the Ein Sof. God is the knowledge, knower, and known. There's no compartments with God. So right now, each one of us, as we wrestle with this in our minds, as we absorb this, we're uniting with the intellect of the Ein Sof. Therefore, we're uniting with the Ein Sof. And that light is shining in our intellect. And it's that realization that makes kabbalistic Torah study so engaging and so exciting, because it's the only way you can have that level of unity with the infinite, right? There's no way a candle flame from one of our chinukiyot can go travel right inside the sphere of the sun and still exist. It couldn't. It'd be gone. And yet, right now, as we're learning Torah, we're united with our source, and we're like a flame from a candle that's traveled back to its source. And that's what's happening as that light's being manifest in our minds. Begashmiut, hare haTorah nim shala l'mayim sheyordim mimakom gavoa chulu kmo shnitbaer le'el. Let's do the next two paragraphs. Thanks, Doreen. You'll unmute. Yeah, you got your unmute. You know what? Let's do you the next one. If you, Doreen, unmute for us. Rick, why don't you take this paragraph? And Doreen, you want to unmute your if you can find it.
Although one grasps Torah only as it is clothed in physical terms, that is the law concerning two men who clutch a garment, or one who takes a cow for a donkey. How then can it be said that through Torah, through study of such laws, one attains this lofty level of unity with godliness?
And go on, yeah.
Yet the Torah has been likened to water descending from a high place. The water on the lower level is exactly the same as it was on the higher level. Similarly, the laws of Torah, although they have descended to deal with ordinary physical situations, still consist of God's will and wisdom. Thus, in studying Torah, one is united with God's will and wisdom, and thereby with God himself, as explained above.
So this is a big leap, and yet, if you can sort of get yourself into that zone, as it were, and say, well, I'm sitting here discussing the detailed laws of two people arrived at a court, both of them holding a coat or a shawl, and they're both grabbing onto it, and they're both saying, it's mine, this is mine. And so what do we decide? He has a corner, he doesn't have a corner. It was the intricate laws all about why and how we would manage this physical garment between these two physical people, and it's a court of law. And so many people learn this in so much detail and memorize it, not because they ever think they're going to be on a court that will have to try this. These are not lawyers that are learning law or judges learning law because practically they'll ever have to put it into place. They're learning it because of this reason, because that's God's intellect that is able to flow down into the world like water, unchanged, still united with God. And so when we learn it, when we ingest it, when we make it part of ourselves, now that godly light is manifest. That's the kabbalistic gateway to be able to unite with the infinite. And that metaphor of water is so beautiful because, of course, we get confused. A child might think, as I said last week, there's a rain cloud and there's rain coming down from the cloud, and they think, I'd like to catch that rain. How can I reach my hands up and catch that rain? It's so beautiful and exciting. And a parent will say, well, the rain's falling down here. Just put your hand out. The rain you're catching here is the same rain just as it comes out from the clouds. It's exactly the same water, no matter how far down it goes, or even if it lands in a river and you drink from the river, it's the same exact rainwater. And the same thing with this discussion about a shawl or an ox that's gored or whatever it is. God is able to flow down into these physical discussions, and it's still God's intellect united with God. Yes, Noreen.
So it doesn't matter how mundane the law is or the section that you're studying, it's all the same, coming from the same source and having the same effect. Is
exactly. Exactly. You might think, well, I want to unite with God, the spiritual side of the Torah. You should love God and what that means, and prayer or high holidays and learning about those rules. That's the holy side of the Torah. So I should focus on that if I want to unite with God. But stories that we learn or laws about, just physical stuff. There's laws about, when you need to relieve yourself. If you're in a minyan, how far you need to go, how much you need to dig, disgusting stuff to talk about. I mean, the Torah gets pretty gross or pretty graphic. No matter how physical it becomes, that's still God's intellect. Like you said, Noreen, it doesn't matter how plain, simple, mundane, and physical the law is, like water. And another quality of water is that it actually flows to the lowest place, you'll notice, right? Wherever water's running, it's finding someplace lower than itself and lower until it finally reaches sea level, and that's the lowest place it can run. So God's intellect is like that too. It actually keeps running until it hits the very lowest place, no matter how mundane. Yes, Sharon?
So it's the process, it's not the topic.
You could say that. Yeah. The topic.
It's your process of thinking and uniting. It's not what you're thinking and uniting about.
Right. Yeah. You put any Torah subject in there, your process of learning Torah, that is how you unite with the Ein Sof. And it can be any Torah subject, absolutely, including Tanya, including Halacha, including Midrash, whatever.
Thank you.
What about the rabbinic prohibitions and how do they fit into all this? Are they the same flow as the Torah prohibitions and mitzvahs?
Yeah, it gets hard for us to picture this because we're stuck in time and we see a sage that lived, thousands of years after the giving of the Torah. What's it got to do with what came down in the Torah? Isn't that different? But we say everything came down in one zip file on Sinai, and it's being unzipped throughout time because Torah exists above time. So some situation with a jet airplane or a cell phone or genetically engineered meat, and is it kosher or not kosher, that they never would have dreamed of in the time of our sages. And now the sages of our generation, the best we have, meet, and they figure it out. And and by the way, never mind the by the way. So those new decisions that they never could have imagined, those all came down with the Torah, but they were still zipped. They were in the zip file, right? We didn't unzip them until reality needed them. So that's why certainly all the literature up until the Gemara is closed, you know, the whole Talmud and all that literature, and many stages after, right? If you look at, Rambam's Mishneh Torah, that's much later. That's all considered part of learning Torah because they're learning the oral tradition and all the decisions that came down with the Torah, but we weren't aware of until they were opened up and expanded later in time. That's a little out there, but basically it includes everything, whatever you're learning. You want to learn, the Shulchan Aruch, that falls into this category for sure. And even though it was written just a few centuries ago, that's our latest traditional version of the oral tradition that came down on Sinai, and it's absolutely part of that flow. Lo hamidrash ikar ela hamaseh. Doreen, you ready? You want to take this one, nevertheless?
Yes. Yet the Torah has been likened to water descending from a high place. The water on the lower level is exactly the same as it was on the higher level. Similarly, the laws of Torah, although they have descended to deal with ordinary physical situations, still consist of God's will and wisdom. Thus, in studying Torah, one is united with God's will and wisdom, and thereby with God himself, as explained above, chapter 4.
And let's do one more. Nevertheless,
notwithstanding the superior level of unity with godliness attained only by Torah, our sages have said the essential thing is not study, but deed.
So now we're going to make sure this is the main point of our chapter. So we can't now go and say how Torah is worth all the other mitzvahs combined and its quality without reaffirming. But hamaisa hurikar ikar, action is the essence. Action is the core. That's why we're here. So notwithstanding the advantage of Torah, remember, we were created to do action that creates a home for God, and it's all about actually the bottom line of physically doing a physical mitzvah. Vayom lasotam k'tiv umevatlin Talmud Torah l'kiyum mitzvah masit k'she'ir efshar lasota al yedei acharehem. Paula, do you want to read for us? If you unmute, it is also written, bottom of 521.
It is also written this day, i.e., during our life in this world. The all-important thing is to do them, the mitzvot, and the halakha rules that one must interrupt Torah study to perform a mitzvah of action when it cannot be fulfilled by others.
And now the Alter Rebbe points out a pretty well-known rule, which is we are all sitting here learning Torah. So by traditional halakha, if someone passes by the hall and says, "Oh, can you come help me move this table?" just for a mundane thing, I'm not halakhically allowed to get up and leave this class to go help someone move a table, right? Unless it's a mitzvah of some kind, but just any normal activity, you're not permitted to stop learning Torah to go do something else until you're done learning Torah. Then you can go, because it's so important. You're united with God, and you'd get up if you're sitting in front of the governor of Michigan and you're having an important conversation, and you say, "Oh, excuse me, I have to go. My car's out of gas. I'll be back in 10 minutes." Right? The governor would say, "What? I made time for this appointment, and you're just going to get up and leave?" So all the more so, if we're sitting here uniting with God, we're going to get up and we're going to leave that to go do some mundane thing. No, halakhically, you're not even allowed. But if it's a mitzvah, and it's a mitzvah that no one else can do, now I'm actually commanded to close the book, take a break, go take care of the mitzvah that no one else can do, and then come back. So doesn't that show us that although Torah learning is the most elevated way to unite with the Ein Sof, that really a mitzvah takes precedence because I have to stop learning Torah to go to a mitzvah. But it doesn't really make total sense because it's only if it's just me that can do the mitzvah. If there's someone else that can do the mitzvah, now I'm supposed to let them do it, and I continue learning Torah study. So really, shouldn't it be one or the other? If a mitzvah is more important, even if someone else can do it, shouldn't I rush to be the one to do it? It's more important. Shouldn't I stop learning Torah? What does it matter that someone else can do it? And if Torah study is more important, why would I ever leave Torah study to do a mitzvah? It can wait, or, it's less important. And here you see the actual dynamic of which advantage comes from which activity. And that is, if it's about me and it's about self-refinement, nothing beats Torah study, because what's happening? I'm uniting my Chabad, my intellect, with the intellect of the Ein Sof. That light is manifest in me. It's transforming my soul. It's even transforming my Chabad itself. And nothing's better for me than that, to be united with the Ein Sof. My soul is in heaven. It loves it. When I do a physical mitzvah, who's that for? For me or for someone else, right? If Torah study is the best thing for me, the mitzvah is the best thing for who? I see some nods. Oh, we got a whole bunch of people on Facebook. Hi, guys.
Someone
Hi,
else.
Steve. Hi, Norm. Hi, Al. Please leave comments here if you want to join. If you want to join, good to have you. We're in User's Guide for the Soul. So can someone answer that? If Torah study is the best thing for me, a mitzvah is the best for who?
Someone else.
Well, if I give charity, yeah, but ultimately, we've been learning a mitzvah is for who? Who wants a mitzvah?
For all the other Jews.
For God.
For God, right? I just wanted the simple answer, right? God wanted, we learned at the beginning of this section, God created the world to have a home in the lowest realm. That's why the world was created. And God wants that to happen by us creating that home, by doing mitzvahs. So ultimately, a mitzvah, that's me giving God what God wants. That's me giving God pleasure. I don't always enjoy a mitzvah. And really, it doesn't necessarily have the kind of effect on my soul and my intellect as learning Torah. I mean, I could what's a good example? I could search for matzah, all I want, as long as I want on Erev Pesach. It's not necessarily going to make me a better person, a more unified with God person. I did it. I did the mitzvah. It's God that now is a home in my home because I searched for matzah. So what is the answer? It's because Torah study is about me and it is an advantage for me. Whereas the mitzvah, that's God needs done. It doesn't really matter who does it. It's not personal. I get no advantage doing it as I am here. There's a reward, so to speak, afterwards, but it doesn't really have that effect on me. So that's why if I'm sitting and learning Torah, my soul's united with God, I'm being transformed, the light of God is manifest in my intellect. That's improving me tremendously. So if the mitzvah can get done and there's nothing missing there, God's going to get the mitzvah. Now I should take the advantage that's there for me and stay learning Torah. But if that mitzvah is not going to get done, now it overrides Torah learning, because the mitzvah is not about me. It's not about how do I improve myself, how do I unite with God. The mitzvah is about God getting a home down here, and that's the whole purpose of reality. So if I have to do the mitzvah for it to happen, the mitzvah has to happen. That's the bottom line. But if someone else can do it, now it flips. Now it's better for me to get the advantage and stay and learn Torah. So that law about when you have to get up to do a mitzvah from Torah study actually shows the advantage of each of them, Torah study and mitzvahs. Going on, for this, mishum ki ze kol hadam v'taklit briata briato v'iridato la'olam hazeh. I think we're at Sharon. Is it your turn?
Yeah. Are we on 522?
Yeah, right at the top for this.
For this, the active performance of mitzvah is man's entire purpose, the purpose for which he was created and for which his soul descended to this world. So that God may have an abode precisely in the lowest realms, to turn the darkness of this world into the light of holiness, so that God's glory fills specifically the entire physical world, and all flesh will behold godliness together, as was discussed above.
Nice. Beautiful, right? That God should have, it says here, Adir b'tatonim davka. Davka, really a home in the lowest realms. And let's pause from the Tanya for a moment, because we have a little project going that I don't know if people on Facebook or watching afterwards know about, but the whole impact of these 3 chapters is about when you do a physical mitzvah, how you elevate the physical world. And it's so key to the Tanya that the last great master of this tradition, the Rebbe Menachem Mendel Schneerson, actually started a sort of campaign to have copies of the Tanya physically printed in as many different cities as possible, as many cities as possible. And back in the day, they would drive a truck with a printing press and they'd run the papers through as a whole thing. Now, of course, it's much easier with modern printing and printers. So we created a little fund, and thanks to those who donated, your names are going to be in the Tanya. But we're actually printing a Temple Israel Tanya, formerly known as the West Bloomfield Walled Lake Tanya. I live in Walled Lake, Temple's in West Bloomfield. I teach sometimes at home here, so I thought it'd be nice to do a little combo. And the idea is when you print the Tanya here at Temple or in Walled Lake, you're actually taking a piece of that city and you're taking the spark of that paper and that ink and you're elevating it specifically with the power of the Tanya, which talks about that phenomenon. So I have here, you see a trial print of this is the title page, Likutei Amorim. You can see right there, it says Walled Lake, West Bloomfield, Michigan. That's going to be, everyone's going to get one of those copies of that book. And here's the editor's page from Kahoot, from the official editing, the printers of the Tanya. So this is going to be bound in New York. We're printing it. And we're going to print it right out of this class today. I'm leaving this class to go and put into practice Davka, right? Mamash, like physically, we're going to actually put into practice what we're talking about. That we have 3 massive boxes, 15,000 sheets of paper that we're going to print out and then have cut and bound, and we're each going to get a nice copy of the Tanya. And hopefully we'll all have it not to put in our bookshelves, but as the Rebbe said, to put in our hearts. That it should be not on the shelves, but in our hearts. And to be in the heart, it has to go through the mind, it has to go through Chabad. So that's exactly the whole message of the Tanya, that we use this manual for how to live in a real way to really create a home for God in our animal soul, in our physical being, and in our physical environment around us. And that's Tikkun Olam. That's how we elevate the world to get to what we call in Reform Judaism the Messianic era, where everything is just spiritual, although we're still in the physical. Isn't that nice? You guys got any thoughts about that? Yeah, me too.
Contribute?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think it was somebody who did. What was the basic donation? Does someone remember?
180.
Yeah, 180. So 180. But if anyone wants to be part of it, I did already print out the. The back page. This is actually what came from Walled Lake, is the page with all of our donors. So if you want to donate, you'll be part of the project, but we've already got the list there. So just know your name won't be on. And if 180 is more than anyone is comfortable with, whether you're in this class or out there, just be in touch with me, smolash@temple-israel.org, and you can give any amount. And even though we've already done the donor page, you'll be connected with this big mitzvah of printing a Tanya Temple. And trust me, there's another list up in the cosmos, kabbalistically, that your name gets put on in a big way. So any amount is welcome, and it's good to have as many people participating as possible. Doesn't that feel nice?
Yes, wonderful. Books are wonderful,
Pardon me?
Books are wonderful. Making a book is wonderful.
Yeah.
Making this book.
Yes. Now we have to go back, of course. On the other hand, Masha ein kein k'she'efshar la'asota al yedei acherim ein mevatlin Talmud Torah af shekol haTorah eina ela perush hamitzvot masiot. Sue Ellen, I think.
On the other hand, if the mitzvot can be performed by others, one does not interrupt Torah study to perform it, even though the whole Torah is, after all, the only explanation of the mitzvot of action.
We're summing up here the the dichotomy, if you will, right? The Torah connects my soul to the infinite more powerfully and at a higher level, whereas mitzvot elevate reality, and that's what I was created for. Yeah? So ultimately, it comes down to doing the mitzvah. That's the plug. Oh.
Wait, when we study Torah and Tanya, we cannot see God, but God is like inserted into us from our learning, and we merge with God, and that prepares us to perform mitzvahs in a better way.
You're getting to chapter 38 there. That last piece you said, that's chapter 38. So I don't want to go to, it gets us to do mitzvahs in a better way. That's true. And now you got the Alter Rebbe in your mind. You're following his thought process because that's his next chapter. But yes, everything you said until then, that's chapter 37. That when we're learning Torah, Tanya, Mishnah, whatever, that's God's Chabad inserted right into our Chabad, right? That's God's intellect right in our intellect. It's not like math, where I can say I'm learning Newtonian whatever, and that's just something Newton came up with, and I'm learning it. If it's God's intellect, that's God. They're united. So it looks to me like it's just God's ideas. That's actually God's light, God's essence even itself, right there in my Chabad. And you can't do that, by the way, when you're out of a body. Because when you're a soul in heaven, you can't deal with that degree of uniting with God's essence. A soul would just be evaporated. It would have no more existence if it were doing what we're doing now. It couldn't do it. You need to be put in the coarse vessel of a physical body, which can't directly see what's going on with this unity, in order to actually experience the unity. So that's the beauty of this time we have in a life, is that this is our chance to unite with God, to sit down and have a one-on-one and absorb this. Because once you're back out of a body, God willing, in 120 years, now you just have the light. You don't have the essence anymore. But I erase what I said in your minds. He didn't get back to that point. On the other hand, if the mitzvah can be performed by others, you don't interrupt, right? Which means that Torah study is actually better for me, okay? והיינו משום שהיא בחינת חוכמה בינה דת של אין סוף ברוך הוא, ועסקו בה ממשיך עליו אור אין סוף ברוך הוא, ביתר שאת והארה גדולה לאין קץ, מהארה והמשכה על ידי פיקודין שהן איברין דמלכה. I have Eleanor next. So is that our order?
I just didn't know where. Are we at this is what?
523, yeah. This is because.
Oh, this is because the Torah is the level of Chabad of the blessed Ein Sof. And hence, when one is engaged in studying it, he draws upon himself an infinite greater illumination of the blessed Ein Sof light, greater both in its illuminative power and its higher quality than the illumination and influence one draws upon his soul through mitzvah, which are organs of the king.
Right, so just like we said, yes, I have organs of my soul that correspond to each of the mitzvot, and those are organs of the Ein Sof, so to speak, and I interface with them, and that infuses me with divine light, yes. But that's just an organ. That's just the pinky, right? If you want to get to the essence, that's the Chabad of the Ein Sof. That takes Torah study. And for that, you can't compare the illumination that happens right now in our minds by uniting with the intellect of the Ein Sof to the illumination that happens when I integrate the organs of the Ein Sof, so to speak, with my organs. וזהו שאמר רב ששת חדאי נפשי לך קראי לך תנאי. Joyce, are you?
I'm here.
Okay.
Are we doing what emerges, or this is what?
This is 523. The middle. This is what?
Okay, this is what Rav Sheshet meant when he said, "Rejoice, my soul, for you do I study Scripture. For you do I study Mishnah." So
you could see that as being poetic. Someone saying, rejoice, my soul. It's for you that I learned Torah. It's good. I'm happy. But really, we're saying the divine soul right now, we're doing it such a favor because now it's united with God. And all day I walk around and my divine soul is giving energy to my animal soul, and I'm eating and I'm driving around and I'm doing my work and I'm earning money and I'm having conversations, I'm playing cards. And now I take an hour and the divine soul is now united with God. And that's what it came down here for, to unite with God and to have that essence, that essential light flow right into it. It's in heaven, literally. As explained elsewhere in length, and we're on 524. והנה המשכה והערה זו שהאדם ממשיך מאיר מהארת אור אינסוף ברוך הוא, על נפשו ועל נפשות כל ישראל. Oi, are we getting bigger now? Who's reading? Ruth, would you like to take 524, this influence?
I'm missing a couple of pages, so I can start reading at 528.
Okay, we'll try and come back. Dan, why don't you start us over again?
This influence and illumination generated by one's Torah study, which man draws from the radiance of Ein Sof, light upon his soul and upon the souls of all Israel.
Now he suddenly said the souls of all Israel. Hold on, what's going on? So here's the beauty of it. If you remember, there's something called the Shechina we've been talking about. It's the same as Knesset Yisrael, another term we learned. It's the same as Malchut of Atzilus, if you've learned the Kabbalah with us in chapter 3. And that is the source of every soul of Israel. Great or less great, living in the past, living in the future. Every soul comes from the same source, Knesset Yisrael, or the Shechina. And so when we bring light down to unite with the Shechina, to the source of our soul, it's not just my soul that light illuminates, it's the soul of every single person in Israel. Every single Jewish person who's ever lived. We're all one being, so to speak, and we all have that root in Shechina, in Knesset Yisrael. And so I'm not just getting light personally, I'm actually bringing a light that shines into the soul of every single Jew, however conscious of it they may be. Amazing. He Hashchina Knesset Yisrael Makor Kol Nishmot Yisrael Kmo Sheitbayer L'Kaman. Noreen? You need to unmute if you can.
Meaning, as will be explained later, that the light is drawn into the spiritual level known as the Shechina, Knesset Yisrael, the source of all the souls of Israel, and thereby Ein Sof light reaches not only the soul of the person studying Torah, but also that of every Jew.
Right, so there's, we'll get into this in chapter 41. We come back to this, but just in brief, there's actually a phrase that's said before we start our morning prayers in certain liturgies, and other communities, I think Sephardim say it before any mitzvah that they do as a tradition, and that is L'Shem Yichud Kudsha Brichu Shchinte. I'm doing this to unite the Or Ein Sof, Kudsha Brichu, and the Shechina. So the reason I'm doing this mitzvah, or Torah study, or whatever it is to unite kabbalistically the midot with Malchut of Atzilus, to unite the Or Ein Sof with its Shechina. And so every time I learn Torah, that's exactly what I'm doing. I'm bringing light down from the midot of the Ein Sof, or the midot of Atzilus, if you like, and it's shining and uniting with the Shechina, which is the source of all the souls of Israel. So the Torah, that's the light of Ein Sof, that's the Kudsha Brichu. Me, I'm the Shechina. So when I bring God's light to unite with me, I'm also bringing Kudsha Brichu, right? The godliness that's in Atzilus, or God's light, and uniting it with the source of all souls of Israel. So don't think, as we're doing this now, it's only us that's benefiting from the light. All of Temple Israel and all of the Jews of Michigan, all the Jews of the world, and all the Jews that will live and have lived, every one of them gets a share of this light and unites with God. So it's an unimaginable advantage and unity that we create when we're learning Torah from that perspective.
Flow to everybody.
Say that again?
The flow down to everybody and everything here on earth?
Yeah, you can call it a flow, although in Kabbalah it's more called a light and an illumination and a union. The flow is more how the intellect comes down to express itself in an ox that's gored, right? So that's kind of maybe a flow that Torah is like water that can flow down to that place. But here we're talking about a unity. But these words, the thing is something amazing. So maybe flow works for you. I'm okay with that. Yeah, Sharon?
So maybe it's a glow, not the flow.
Yeah.
Right, the glow, not the flow. It's always good if it rhymes, isn't it?
That's good.
Yeah.
See, we're getting smarter by the minute.
Beautiful.
This illumination, which one draws through his Torah study, is referred to as calling, as in the Talmudic expression concerning a Torah student, usually translated as one who reads or studies the Torah, but reinterpreted here as one who calls God through the Torah.
Right, so when someone reads Torah, a bar mitzvah that reads Torah at Temple Israel, it's called Koreh Batorah, reading from the Torah. But here the author of it says, it's not reading from the Torah, it's calling through the Torah. And who are you calling? You're calling God. You're saying, God, I want to spend some time with you. I want you to come. And when you learn Torah or recite Torah, you're actually calling God through the Torah so that God comes right here, and not even God's light, but God's essence itself that no angel can touch. And God comes right here and is right with us, God's essence. And if you really internalize that, every time you sit down to learn Torah, as the Alter Rebbe will say, that creates a sense of awe and a sense of, I don't know, the depth of the importance of the interaction that God, I just open the book and God comes right here. God's essence is right here. I'm calling to God and God comes and responds, and not just a light, not just a phone call, but God actually is here. And like my teacher Laibl always says, okay, can you prove that to me? No. Can you disprove it? No. But which one of the two, say it's a 50-50 chance, and we don't know, which one of the two makes Torah learning more fun? Right? Which would you rather be doing? So there's an advantage to internalizing that every time we open the Torah, we're calling to God, and God responds and comes right here and unites with my Chabad. And boy, if you wanna supercharge your Torah learning, you're in a high functioning state, taking that side of the coin. So why not just randomly pick that, even for that reason?
This phrase means that in Torah study, one calls God to come to him, so to speak. As a man.
וכבן קטן הקורא לאביו לבוא אליו להיות עמו בצוותא חדה ולא להיפרד ממנו ולהישאר יחידי חס ושלום.
As a man calls his friend to come to him, or a child will call his father to come and join him and not to part from him, leaving him alone, God forbid.
Right, so when you call to somebody, they come. Your father, your friend. Same thing here. We're calling to God by learning Torah, and God's essence is here. And if even for a moment while you're learning, you can get in that zone, or you can vibe with that, it's amazing. It's amazing. If it's okay, I'm gonna not do our meditation practice because I'd like to get to the end of the chapter today, and just relate one story that sums it up. So if you're one of the people doing the meditation practice with us, we have it on every week. I feel free to go back and pick another week, or stay after and meditate, but I do want to get to the end. I hate to skip it, but let's finish the chapter. Right? How many times have you heard that line, right, Noreen? And listen to it now. We at, sorry, who just read? Is it Paula?
This is the meaning of the verse, God is near to all who call him, to all who call him in truth. And there is no truth but Torah, indicating that one calls God with truth as opposed to simply calling God only by calling God through Torah study.
Right, so the Alter Rebbe brings out the double expression, right? You could have said just God is near to all who call him in truth, right? Why near to all who call him in truth? That truth, that emet, that in our Kabbalist tradition, that is God's intellect coming through all the avenues of the Torah. And how often do we hear that phrase from Psalms, God's near to all who call, and now it's right there. We understand that we're going through this channel of our Torah tradition, and that allows us to unite impossibly with an infinite being. Sharon, are we you?
This,
in contrast, 526 at the top.
In contrast to one who does not call him through Torah study, but merely cries, Father, Father.
Right. Sue Ellen?
Over he who thus calls God, the prophet laments. There is none who calls by your name, as explained elsewhere.
By dwelling on this matter, an intelligent person will draw upon himself a great awe of God whenever we open up Torah or Tanya. And here at the end of the chapter, the Alter Rebbe makes a distinction between perhaps the New Age approach, which might say it's all about my calling to the infinite and my spiritual level, and if I can refine myself and meditate and have spiritual experiences, that will connect me to the Ein Sof. And in fact, the basics of Kabbalah say the spiritual world is no closer to God than the physical world. God is equally hidden, equally apart from every world, the spiritual and the physical. And it's not just my spiritual state or my yearning and reaching out to the infinite that can create that connection. There's no possible way for a limited being to connect with an unlimited being. It's only if the infinite being reaches out and creates a channel. So that's why we have to rely on that we're actually creating a Kabbalistic link via God's Wi-Fi. And we have to call God with God's Wi-Fi because I can't create a Wi-Fi to reach God. And now that Wi-Fi is down here, now that we have it, we can call to God and trust and know that God's essence comes down. And now, as we'll learn in the next chapter, now my emotions can elevate the experience, but I need the basic connection first. And let's finish with a story that really sums this up, this idea of using the Torah to call to God. There was, let's see, this was the Tzemach Tzedek. So this is the third Rebbe of this tradition. This is the grandchild of the Alter Rebbe. And for various reasons, he was raised by the Alter Rebbe himself and grew up in the Alter Rebbe's house, and Zayda was his dad. And at one point, he was playing with the Alter Rebbe as a little child, and they're playing a game of hide and seek. And the Alter Rebbe was holding the Tzemach Tzedek, this little boy, and he was saying, "Vu is Zayda? Where's Zayda? Where's Zayda?" And he'd point to his beard and say, "Is this Zayda?" And the Tzemach Tzedek would say, the Tzemach Tzedek would point to the beard. Sorry, I'm losing a detail there. The Tzemach said, "Yeah, that's Zayda," and the Alter Rebbe would say, "No, that's just Zayda's beard," And he point to his eyes. "Is this Zayda?" And he say, "No, that's just Zayda's eyes." And they go on. It was a little game, and the Alter Rebbe thought the game was over with this very precocious, master in the making, the Tzemach Tzedek. And he put him down, and he kind of off he went. And suddenly he heard a shriek, "Ah!" And he looks, and there's the Tzemach Tzedek with his finger right next to the door, and it looks like he's hurt his finger in the door. And he hears his name. He does not just right. He says, "Zayda, Zayda!" He screams, "Zayda!" That's how the story goes. And the Alter Rebbe looks over and sees the scene, and his heart jumps into his mouth. And the Tzemach Tzedek says, "Das is Zayda. That's Zayda." That's my Zeta. That's who you are. When I called to you like that, when you knew I needed you, it wasn't your mouth, it wasn't your eyes, it wasn't your nose, it wasn't your beard. That thing, your essence, that's you. And when I call to you, you come to me. And beautiful that Tzemach Tzedek, even as a child, created this beautiful story with his way of answering his Zeta, the Alter Rebbe. And that's exactly what we do. You can know that whatever's going on in your mind, whatever the stresses in your life, whatever things I may need to work on in my life or I may have to improve, when I earnestly sit down and open up any Torah here at Temple Israel, and I use it as we're learning to call to God, Koreh b'Torah, to call to God, just like a Zeta was always going to come and be there, and the Alter Rebbe was right there with his essence. That's how God behaves with us, and that's where God is right now with us, and perhaps looking forward to us now going to print our Temple Israel Tanya, which we'll all have, as I said, to put in our hearts and not on our shelves. So we'll wrap up there. Thanks for sticking with us. Sorry we didn't do our meditation. I'll try and revisit that next week and make it a regular practice, but I invite you to each do that daily if you have the time. I'm going to sign off from Facebook now. So thanks for joining us if you've been on Facebook.